The autumn leaves crunched beneath Detective Maria Rodriguez's boots as she walked up the front steps of the weathered Victorian house in Burlington, Vermont. October 2024 had brought an unusually cold snap, and her breath formed small clouds in the crisp morning air. In her weathered leather portfolio, she carried photographs that had surfaced just 3 days ago. Photographs that could finally shed light on a case that had haunted this small college town for 35 years. Margaret Maggie Sullivan had vanished without a trace on November 3, 1989, after attending a Halloween party at the University of Vermont. She was 18 years old, a freshman studying art history, with dreams of becoming a museum curator. The last anyone saw of her, she was leaving the party around midnight, wearing a vintage red dress she'd found at a thrift shop and carrying a small beaded purse that had belonged to her grandmother. Before we continue with Maggie's story, if you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. The photographs in Detective Rodriguez's possession had been discovered in the estate sale of Harold Brennan, a local photographer who had passed away the previous month. His nephew, while sorting through decades of negatives and prints stored in the basement, had stumbled upon a collection of candid street photography from the late 1980s. Among the images of Burlington's downtown scenes, college students, and autumn festivals, one photograph stood out with chilling clarity. Detective Rodriguez knocked on the door, and moments later it opened to reveal Thomas Sullivan, now 58 years old, his once dark hair silver at the temples. His eyes still held the haunted look she'd seen in family members who'd never found closure. Behind him appeared his wife Linda, and their adult son James, who had been born 3 years after Maggie's disappearance. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you for agreeing to see me," Detective Rodriguez said softly. "I believe we may have found something significant." Thomas led her into the living room, where framed photographs of Maggie still occupied places of honor on the mantelpiece. School pictures, family vacations, her high school graduation, a life frozen in time at 18 years old. Linda Sullivan sat heavily in her armchair, the same one she'd occupied during countless interviews over the decades, always hoping this time would bring answers. Detective Rodriguez carefully removed the photograph from her portfolio and placed it on the coffee table. The image, taken by Harold Brennan on November 4, 1989, just 1 day after Maggie's disappearance, showed a section of downtown Burlington near the waterfront. The photograph captured a group of people near the old ferry terminal, but what made Rodriguez's pulse quicken was visible in the background, a small beaded purse partially hidden behind a wooden crate near the dock. Linda Sullivan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's her purse. My mother's purse. I'd recognize it anywhere." The beaded purse had been a family heirloom, passed down from Maggie's great-grandmother, who had immigrated from Ireland in the early 1900s. Its intricate pattern of blue and silver beads caught light in a distinctive way, and Linda had taught Maggie about its history when she'd given it to her for her 18th birthday, just 2 months before her disappearance. Thomas leaned forward, studying the photograph intently. "Who are those people in the picture? Do we know who they are?" Detective Rodriguez nodded grimly. "We've identified most of them. The photograph was taken around 2 p.m. on November 4th. This group appears to be dock workers and local fishermen, but there's something else." She pointed to a figure partially obscured in the shadows near a building. "Enhancement technology has improved significantly since 1989. Our lab was able to clarify this figure, and we believe it shows someone disposing of something in the water." The room fell silent except for the steady tick of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. For 35 years, the Sullivan family had wondered if Maggie had run away, if she'd been abducted, if she'd met with an accident. The discovery of her purse so close to the waterfront suggested something far more sinister. James Sullivan, who had grown up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, spoke for the first time. "Have you searched the water? I mean, with today's technology. We have a dive team scheduled for tomorrow morning," Detective Rodriguez replied. "The area has changed significantly over the decades, new construction, environmental changes, but we're focusing on the section visible from where the purse was found." Linda Sullivan stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking their backyard, where a tire swing still hung from an old maple tree. A swing Thomas had hung for both his children, though James had been the only one to use it. 35 years, she whispered. 35 years of not knowing, of wondering if she was out there somewhere, if she'd chosen to leave, if we'd failed her somehow. Detective Rodriguez had worked missing persons cases for over 2 decades, but she never became immune to the raw pain of families caught in limbo. "Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to know that reopening this case is our top priority. Harold Brennan's photographs represent the first significant lead we've had since the initial investigation." Thomas joined his wife at the window. "Tell us about the original investigation. We were so traumatized back then. So much of it is a blur. What did they miss? What should they have found?" Detective Rodriguez consulted her notes, which included the original case file she'd studied extensively over the past several days. The 1989 investigation was thorough for its time, but they lacked the technology we have today. They interviewed everyone at the party, checked local hospitals, contacted bus stations and airports. Maggie's roommate, Jennifer Walsh, was the last person to see her leave the party. She said Maggie seemed upset about something, but wouldn't talk about it. "Upset about what?" Linda asked, turning back toward the detective. "That was never determined." Jennifer Walsh mentioned that Maggie had received a phone call earlier that evening, before the party. She took the call in their dorm room and seemed changed afterward, quieter, distracted. But Jennifer didn't overhear the conversation, and phone records from 1989 weren't as detailed as they are today. The revelation about the phone call was new information to the Sullivan family. In their grief and desperation, they had focused primarily on the party itself, on who might have followed Maggie, on whether she'd accepted a ride from someone dangerous. The possibility that something had upset her before she even left for the party opened up entirely new questions. James pulled out his phone and began taking notes. "Is Jennifer Walsh still around? Can she be re-interviewed?" "We've located her. She's Jennifer Walsh Martinez now, living in Portland, Oregon. She's agreed to speak with us again, and she's been thinking about that night for 35 years. Sometimes memories surface over time that weren't accessible during the initial trauma." Detective Rodriguez spread out additional photographs from Harold Brennan's collection, creating a timeline of downtown Burlington on November 4th, 1989. The photographer had been documenting what he called the changing face of small-town America, and his candid shots captured ordinary moments that now seemed pregnant with significance. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to another photograph taken about 30 minutes after the first. "The purse is gone." The implication hung heavy in the air. Someone had been at the waterfront. Someone had moved or retrieved Maggie's purse, and Harold Brennan had unknowingly documented it all. His photographs suggested that whatever had happened to Maggie Sullivan, the waterfront area had been significant to her disappearance. As Detective Rodriguez prepared to leave, she noticed Linda Sullivan still standing by the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Mrs. Sullivan, I know this is difficult, but is there anything else about that time period, about Maggie's state of mind in the weeks before her disappearance, that you might not have mentioned in 1989? Linda was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas moved to stand beside her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. Finally, she spoke. She'd been acting differently for about a month before she disappeared. More secretive, more worried about something. She'd always been so open with us, but that October she seemed to be carrying some kind of burden. We thought it was just college stress, maybe boy troubles, but now... Now you think it might have been connected to whatever upset her the night of the party, Detective Rodriguez finished. Linda nodded. She came home the weekend before Halloween, which was unusual because she typically stayed on campus. She spent a lot of time in her room, and I found her going through old family photographs. When I asked her about it, she said she was just feeling nostalgic, but there was something in her eyes. Fear, maybe? Or guilt. Dean, this information would need to be added to the growing list of questions that had emerged from Harold Brennan's photographs. Detective Rodriguez made careful notes, knowing that after 35 years, every detail could be crucial. As she drove back toward the police station, Detective Rodriguez reflected on how a simple estate sale had potentially cracked open one of Burlington's most enduring mysteries. Harold Brennan, who had died never knowing the significance of what he'd captured, had left behind a gift to the Sullivan family, the possibility of finally learning what had happened to their daughter and sister. The next morning arrived grey and cold, with a light snow falling over Lake Champlain. Detective Rodriguez stood on the dock at 6 a.m., watching as the dive team prepared their equipment. The water was frigid, visibility was poor, and they were searching for evidence that had potentially been underwater for 3.5 decades. Chief of Police Robert Hayes had assigned additional resources to the case, understanding both its significance to the community and the media attention it was likely to generate. Burlington was a small city where people remembered Maggie Sullivan's disappearance, where missing person posters had hung in store windows for months, where volunteers had searched wooded areas and questioned strangers. "Detective Rodriguez," called out Lieutenant Kevin Murphy from the dive team, "we're ready to begin the search pattern. Based on the photographs and the current conditions, we're estimating the search zone covers approximately 200 square yards of lake bottom. The dive lasted nearly 4 hours, with team members working in shifts due to the cold water and challenging conditions. Detective Rodriguez remained on the dock, coordinating with the command post and reviewing the enhanced photographs again and again, looking for any detail that might help narrow the search area. At 10:47 a.m., Lieutenant Murphy's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got something down here. Large object appears to be wrapped in material, approximately 30 feet from shore in about 12 feet of water." Detective Rodriguez felt her heart rate increase. After 35 years, this moment felt both surreal and inevitable. The Sullivan family had been notified that the dive was taking place, but they had chosen not to come to the waterfront, instead waiting at home for news. The recovery process took another 2 hours, as the dive team worked carefully to preserve any potential evidence. When the wrapped bundle finally broke the surface, Detective Rodriguez could see that it was indeed large enough to contain human remains. The material appeared to be a heavy canvas tarp, secured with rope that had degraded over the decades underwater. Dr. Patricia Alvarez, the state medical examiner, had been standing by throughout the morning. As the bundle was carefully transported to the dock and then to her van, she spoke quietly with Detective Rodriguez. "I'll need to examine everything in controlled conditions, but the size and shape are consistent with what we might expect. I should have preliminary information within 48 hours." The news spread quickly through Burlington, as it always did in a small city. By afternoon, local television crews had gathered near the waterfront, and Detective Rodriguez found herself holding an impromptu press conference, careful to share information without compromising the investigation. "This morning, our dive team recovered material evidence from Lake Champlain related to the 1989 disappearance of Margaret Sullivan. The evidence is currently being examined by the State Medical Examiner's Office. We ask for the community's patience as we conduct a thorough investigation." That evening, Detective Rodriguez sat in her office, reviewing the original case file again, this time with the knowledge that Maggie Sullivan had most likely never left Burlington at all. The file contained interviews with over 40 people, including fellow students, professors, local business owners, and anyone who might have seen Maggie on November 3rd, 1989. One interview stood out upon this latest reading. Danny Kozlov, a 22-year-old graduate student who had been working part-time at the marina, had mentioned seeing a car parked near the waterfront very late on November 3rd or early on November 4th. At the time, investigators had noted the information but hadn't pursued it aggressively, as there had been no other evidence pointing to the waterfront area. According to the interview notes, Kozlov had been walking home from his job at a nearby restaurant around 2 a.m. when he noticed a dark-colored sedan parked in an unusual location near the dock. He thought it was odd because the marina essentially closed at sunset during the off-season, and there was no legitimate reason for someone to be parked there in the middle of the night. Detective Rodriguez looked up Danny Kozlov in the current database and found that he still lived in the Burlington area, now working as a high school teacher. She made a note to re-interview him, understanding that sometimes witnesses remember additional details decades after the initial interview, especially when they learn how significant their observations might have been. The following day brought Dr. Alvarez's preliminary report, delivered personally to avoid any information leaking before the Sullivan family could be informed. Detective Rodriguez drove to the medical examiner's office, mentally preparing herself for confirmation of what they all suspected. The remains are consistent with a young adult female, Dr. Alvarez reported. Based on bone structure and dental evidence, the age range fits Margaret Sullivan. I'll need to compare dental records for positive identification, but I can tell you that the remains have been underwater for an extended period, consistent with a 1989 timeframe. More significantly, Dr. Alvarez continued, there's evidence of trauma that occurred before death, several fractured ribs, and what appears to be blunt force trauma to the skull. This was not an accidental drowning. Detective Rodriguez felt the familiar weight that came with transforming a missing person case into a homicide investigation. Maggie Sullivan had been murdered, and after 35 years, they finally had her remains. But they still needed to identify who had killed her and why. The drive to the Sullivan house felt longer than usual. Detective Rodriguez had delivered difficult news to families many times throughout her career, but there was something particularly heavy about confirming suspicions that had lingered for over 3 decades. The family had lived with uncertainty for so long that even tragic news might bring a form of relief. Thomas Sullivan answered the door before she had finished knocking, his face immediately reading the gravity of her expression. Linda and James were already waiting in the living room, as if they had sensed this moment approaching. "We found her," Detective Rodriguez said simply. "I'm so very sorry, but we found Maggie." Linda Sullivan's composure, maintained for 35 years of not knowing, finally cracked. Thomas moved to embrace his wife as she sobbed, not just from grief, but from the overwhelming release of decades of wondering, hoping, and fearing. James sat heavily in his father's chair, staring at his hands. After several minutes, Thomas asked the questions that Detective Rodriguez had been expecting. How? When? Did she suffer? The medical examiner will provide more details as the investigation continues, but I can tell you that this is now being treated as a homicide case. We believe Maggie died shortly after her disappearance, and we have evidence that suggests she was the victim of violence. The word homicide seemed to echo in the room. For 35 years, the Sullivan family had wondered if Maggie had chosen to disappear, if she had started a new life somewhere else, if she would someday walk through their front door with explanations and apologies. Learning that she had been murdered meant accepting that she had been gone all along, that no amount of hoping or searching would have brought her home. James looked up at Detective Rodriguez. "Do you have any suspects? Any idea who might have done this? We're reopening the entire investigation with fresh eyes and modern technology. I want you to know that solving this case is our absolute priority. Someone took Maggie from your family, and they've been living with that secret for 35 years. We're going to find them." As Detective Rodriguez prepared to leave, she noticed that Linda Sullivan had moved to Maggie's photographs on the mantelpiece, touching each frame gently. "She was so beautiful," Linda whispered. "She had so many dreams, so many plans. She wanted to travel, to see art in museums around the world. She would have been 53 years old now. She might have had children, grandchildren for us." "Mrs. Sullivan," Detective Rodriguez said softly, "I promise you that we won't rest until we have answers. Maggie's story didn't end that night in 1989. Her story continues now with finding justice." Over the following days, Detective Rodriguez began the process of re-interviewing everyone connected to the original case. Technology had advanced dramatically since 1989, and DNA analysis could now be performed on evidence that had been insufficient for testing 3 decades earlier. The canvas tarp that had wrapped Maggie's remains might yield fingerprints, fiber evidence, or other forensic clues that could identify her killer. The first re-interview was with Jennifer Walsh-Martinez, now a social worker in Portland, Oregon. Video conferencing allowed her to participate in the investigation without traveling back to Burlington, though she expressed a desire to attend any future court proceedings. "I've thought about that night thousands of times over the years," Jennifer told Detective Rodriguez over the video call. "Maggie was my best friend, and I've carried guilt about not doing more to help her, not insisting she tell me what was bothering her. Tell me about the phone call she received that evening before the party." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, clearly accessing memories she had preserved for 35 years. "It was around 6 p.m. We were getting ready for the party, doing our makeup, picking out costumes. The phone rang, and when Maggie answered, I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Her whole body language changed." "Did you hear any part of the conversation?" "Not much. I was in the bathroom doing my hair, but I heard her say something like, 'I can't do that, and you promised you wouldn't tell anyone.'" When she hung up, she was completely different. Quiet, distracted, almost like she was scared. This information aligned with what Linda Sullivan had observed about Maggie's behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Someone had been pressuring her, threatening her in some way, and that pressure had culminated in the phone call on November 3rd. "Did Maggie mention being afraid of anyone? Any problems with other students, professors, anyone from home?" Jennifer shook her head. "That's what made it so confusing. Maggie was popular, kind, smart. She got along with everyone. She'd never mentioned feeling threatened or having serious problems with anyone. That's why the phone call was so jarring. It was like seeing a completely different side of her that I didn't know existed." Detective Rodriguez made careful notes, understanding that the phone call represented a crucial piece of the timeline. If they could determine who had called Maggie that evening, they might identify her killer. The next interview was with Danny Kozloff, now a 57-year-old high school history teacher. Meeting him at his school during his lunch break, Detective Rodriguez was struck by how clearly he remembered that night in 1989, despite the passage of time. "I've actually thought about that car many times over the years, especially when Maggie Sullivan's case would come up in the news," he told her. "I always wondered if I should have done something different, reported it immediately instead of waiting until the police interviewed me." "Describe the car again, and the location where you saw it." "It was a dark sedan, maybe blue or black, hard to tell in the darkness. It was parked near the old ferry terminal, close to where the fishing boats would dock. The weird thing was that it was positioned like someone was trying to hide it, pulled back behind some equipment storage buildings. Danny paused, clearly concentrating. "You know, there's something I never mentioned in the original interview, something I didn't think was important at the time. When I walked past, I thought I saw someone near the water, like they were carrying something heavy, but it was dark, and I was tired from work, so I convinced myself I was imagining things." Detective Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken. "Someone carrying something heavy near the water?" "Yes, and now that I know what you found in the lake, I think I might have witnessed someone disposing of Maggie's body. I've lived with that possibility for 35 years, wondering if I could have prevented it or helped solve the case sooner." This testimony placed a suspect at the waterfront during the critical time frame, and it corroborated the theory that Maggie had been murdered and her body disposed of in Lake Champlain. Detective Rodriguez arranged for Danny to work with a sketch artist, hoping to recover any details about the person he might have seen. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of evidence recovered from the lake was yielding promising results. The canvas tarp had preserved some fiber evidence, and preliminary analysis suggested that the rope used to secure it was a specific type commonly used for marine applications in the 1980s. More importantly, DNA analysis was being performed on biological evidence found with the remains. Dr. Alvarez called Detective Rodriguez with an update that would significantly advance the investigation. "We've recovered DNA evidence that doesn't belong to the victim. It's degraded but sufficient for comparison purposes. If you can identify potential suspects, we may be able to establish a match." The investigation now had physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and a timeline that was beginning to make sense. Someone had contacted Maggie on the evening of November 3rd, creating enough distress that her roommate and family had noticed changes in her behavior. That same night, after the party, someone had taken Maggie to the waterfront area, killed her, and disposed of her body in Lake Champlain. Detective Rodriguez began creating a list of everyone who would have had Maggie's phone number and could have contacted her that evening. The list included family members, friends from high school and college, professors, and anyone she might have met during her first months at the University of Vermont. One name that appeared in the original case file caught her attention: Professor Michael Brennan, who had taught Maggie's art history survey course. Interestingly, he shared a last name with Harold Brennan, the photographer whose pictures had led to the discovery of Maggie's purse and ultimately her remains. Professor Michael Brennan had been interviewed in 1989 as part of the routine questioning of Maggie's instructors, but the interview had been brief and focused primarily on her academic performance and attendance. At the time, he had been 34 years old, well regarded in his department, and had expressed appropriate concern about Maggie's disappearance. Detective Rodriguez pulled the personnel files for Professor Brennan and discovered that he had left the University of Vermont in 1991, citing personal reasons. His forwarding address led to a position at a small college in upstate New York, where he had remained until his retirement in 2018. More intriguingly, a closer examination of Harold Brennan's background revealed that he and Professor Michael Brennan were indeed related. Harold was Michael's uncle. This family connection meant that Michael would have known about his uncle's photography habits, including his frequent documentation of downtown Burlington's street scenes. Detective Rodriguez felt the familiar tingle that came with discovering a potentially significant connection. She immediately began researching Michael Brennan's current whereabouts and found that he was still living in upstate New York, in a small town about 4 hours from Burlington. The drive to interview retired Professor Michael Brennan took Detective Rodriguez through the beautiful autumn landscape of rural New York, but her mind was focused entirely on the questions she needed to ask. After 35 years, this could be the conversation that finally provided answers to the Sullivan family. Michael Brennan's house was a modest colonial on a tree-lined street with a well-maintained garden and a mailbox that read, M. Brennan, retired. When he answered the door, Detective Rodriguez saw a man in his late 70s, still tall and distinguished, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Professor Brennan, I'm Detective Rodriguez from the Burlington Police Department. I'd like to speak with you about Margaret Sullivan. His reaction was immediate and telling. His face paled slightly, and his hand tightened on the doorframe. Margaret Sullivan. That was so long ago. Have there been developments in her case? Yes, sir. Significant developments. May I come in? Professor Brennan led her into a living room filled with art books and academic journals, the home of someone who had spent his life studying and teaching. On the walls hung several framed photographs that Detective Rodriguez immediately recognized as Harold Brennan's work. Professor Brennan, we've recently recovered Margaret Sullivan's remains from Lake Champlain, and we're treating her death as a homicide. I need to ask you some questions about your relationship with her and about the evening she disappeared. He sat heavily in an armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 79 years. I've dreaded this conversation for 35 years. I knew that someday someone would ask the right questions. Detective Rodriguez felt the case shifting into focus. What happened on November 3rd, 1989, Professor Brennan? Michael Brennan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Maggie was a remarkable student. Brilliant, passionate about art, eager to learn. She would come to my office hours regularly, and we would discuss everything from Renaissance painters to contemporary installations. Over time, our conversations became more personal. He looked up at Detective Rodriguez, his eyes filled with decades of guilt and fear. I was married, Detective. I had 2 young children, but I was attracted to Maggie in a way that was completely inappropriate, completely wrong. She was 18, I was 34, I was her professor. I knew it was unethical, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. Did you have a sexual relationship with Margaret Sullivan? Yes. The words seemed to cost him enormous effort. It started in October, about a month before she disappeared. She was confused about it, felt guilty, said she'd never been involved with an older man, never done anything like that. But she seemed to care for me, at least at first. Detective Rodriguez made careful notes, understanding that she was finally hearing the truth about what had led to Maggie's murder. What happened on November 3rd? Did you call her that evening? Professor Brennan nodded miserably. She'd been trying to end the relationship for about a week. She said it was wrong, that she felt guilty, that she was worried about what would happen if anyone found out. I was desperate to see her, to convince her not to tell anyone, to keep our secret safe. So, you called her before the party. Yes, I begged her to meet me after the party, said we needed to talk. She didn't want to, but I told her that if she didn't agree to see me, I would have to consider whether she was mature enough to handle the advanced art history course she wanted to take in the spring. Detective Rodriguez felt a surge of anger at the manipulation and abuse of power that Professor Brennan was describing. You threatened her academically to force her to meet you. I was panic thinking. My marriage, my career, everything was at stake. I convinced myself that if I could just talk to her, I could make her understand that what we had was special, that we needed to protect it. Where did you meet her? Near the waterfront. I told her to meet me by the old ferry terminal after the party. I said we could talk privately there, that no one would see us together. His voice broke. I never intended for anyone to get hurt, Detective. You have to believe that. But Detective Rodriguez was beginning to understand that the encounter at the waterfront had gone very differently than Professor Brennan had intended. What happened when she met you there? Professor Brennan stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Detective Rodriguez. She was angry, angrier than I'd ever seen her. She said she was going to report our relationship to the university administration, that she realized how wrong it had been, that she couldn't live with keeping the secret anymore. And how did you respond to that? I panicked completely. I begged her not to ruin my life, not to destroy my family. I offered to give her better grades, to write recommendation letters, anything she wanted if she would just keep quiet about what had happened between us. But she refused. She said that was exactly the problem, that I was still trying to use my position to manipulate her. She said she was going to tell the truth about everything, regardless of the consequences for me. Professor Brennan turned back to face Detective Rodriguez, tears streaming down his face. I grabbed her arm, trying to stop her from walking away. She pulled back, and I pushed her harder than I meant to. She fell and hit her head on the concrete dock. Detective Rodriguez felt the pieces of the 35-year-old puzzle finally clicking into place. She was unconscious? I thought she was dead. There was blood, and she wasn't moving. I panicked completely. I couldn't call for help because it would mean admitting what I'd done, admitting the relationship, destroying everything. So I wrapped her in a tarp from one of the boats and put her in the lake. The confession hung in the air between them. After 35 years of wondering, searching, and hoping, the Sullivan family finally had their answer. Professor Michael Brennan had killed Maggie Sullivan to protect his secret, then spent decades living with the knowledge of what he had done. Professor Brennan, was Margaret still alive when you put her in the lake? He collapsed back into his chair, sobbing. I don't know. I thought she was dead, but I don't know for certain. I've lived with that uncertainty for 35 years, wondering if I could have saved her, wondering if she was still alive when... Detective Rodriguez arrested Professor Michael Brennan for the murder of Margaret Sullivan. As she read him his rights, she thought about the Sullivan family, who would finally have answers, and about Maggie, whose life had been cut short by a selfish act of violence disguised as passion. The drive back to Burlington felt different than the drive out. Detective Rodriguez called ahead to inform Chief Hayes about the confession and to arrange for Professor Brennan to be processed and held pending formal charges. She also called the Sullivan family to let them know that they had arrested Maggie's killer. The media attention was intense when news of the arrest became public. Professor Michael Brennan, the respected art history professor who had taught for over 30 years, had murdered his 18-year-old student to cover up their inappropriate relationship. The case highlighted issues of power dynamics, academic exploitation, and the devastating consequences of abuse by authority figures. During the formal interview process at Burlington Police Department, Professor Brennan provided additional details that helped complete the timeline of that November night in 1989. He had driven to the waterfront in his Uncle Harold's car, which he had borrowed earlier that day. After disposing of Maggie's body, he had seen her purse on the dock and thrown it behind some crates, planning to retrieve it later and dispose of it more thoroughly. I went back the next day to get the purse, but there were people around, workers at the dock, he admitted. I was afraid someone would see me, so I left it there. I never imagined that my uncle would be taking photographs in that area. The irony was not lost on anyone involved in the investigation. Harold Brennan's passion for documenting everyday life in Burlington had ultimately provided the evidence needed to solve his nephew's crime. The photographs that had gathered dust in a basement for decades had finally brought justice for Maggie Sullivan. Professor Brennan's confession was corroborated by physical evidence recovered from the lake, including DNA evidence that matched his profile. The rope used to secure the tarp was traced to marine suppliers that had serviced boats at the Burlington waterfront in 1989, and fiber evidence linked the tarp to similar materials used by commercial fishermen during that time period. As the case moved toward prosecution, Detective Rodriguez reflected on the impact that Professor Brennan's crime had on the Sullivan family and on the broader Burlington community. Maggie's murder had been especially devastating because it had involved a betrayal by someone in a position of trust and authority. Professor Brennan had used his power as an educator to manipulate a young student, and when she had tried to assert her agency and speak the truth, he had killed her to silence her. The trial of Michael Brennan for the murder of Margaret Sullivan began in the spring of 2025, nearly 36 years after her death. The courtroom was packed with community members, former students, and advocates for victims of sexual assault and academic exploitation. The Sullivan family sat in the front row, finally able to witness justice for their daughter and sister. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Catherine Mills, presented a compelling case that combined Professor Brennan's confession with physical evidence and witness testimony. Danny Kozloff testified about seeing the suspicious car and figure near the waterfront. Jennifer Walsh-Martinez spoke about the phone call that had upset Maggie, and Dr. Alvarez provided detailed forensic evidence about the cause of death. Professor Brennan's defense attorney argued that the incident had been an accident, that his client had never intended to kill Maggie Sullivan, and that his actions afterward had been the result of panic rather than premeditation. However, the prosecution successfully argued that Professor Brennan's abuse of his position, his manipulation of Maggie, and his decision to dispose of her body rather than seek help demonstrated consciousness of guilt and disregard for human life. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of manslaughter and abuse of a corpse. Judge Patricia Holbrook sentenced Professor Michael Brennan to 25 years in prison, acknowledging that while he had not premeditated Maggie's murder, his actions had destroyed a young woman's life and caused decades of suffering for her family. In her victim impact statement, Linda Sullivan addressed Professor Brennan directly. "You stole our daughter from us when she was just beginning her adult life. You stole her dreams, her potential, her future children and grandchildren. But most of all, you stole 35 years of our lives, 35 years of wondering and hoping and never knowing the truth. No sentence can give us back what you took from us, but at least now Maggie can rest in peace, and we can finally begin to heal." Thomas Sullivan also spoke, focusing on Maggie's character and the impact of her loss. Maggie was kind, intelligent, and full of life. She trusted you as her professor, looked up to you as someone who could help her pursue her dreams of working in museums and studying art history. Instead, you exploited that trust and took advantage of her youth and inexperience. When she tried to do the right thing, when she tried to speak the truth, you killed her to protect yourself. That is something you will have to live with for the rest of your life. James Sullivan, who had grown up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, spoke about the impact of finally having answers. "For my entire adult life, I've wondered who my sister really was, what she might have become, whether she would have approved of the man I've become. Living with her disappearance shaped every aspect of our family's life. Now we know the truth, and while it's painful, it's also liberating." Maggie was a victim, but she was also brave enough to try to speak out against abuse of power. Her courage cost her life, but it also serves as an example for others who find themselves in similar situations. Following the trial, the University of Vermont conducted a comprehensive review of its policies regarding relationships between faculty and students, implementing new training programs and reporting procedures designed to prevent similar abuses of power. A memorial scholarship was established in Maggie's honor, supporting students studying art history and museum studies. Detective Rodriguez continued working with the Burlington Police Department's cold case unit, understanding that Professor Brennan's arrest and conviction represented just one success in the ongoing effort to seek justice for victims and provide closure to families. The case had reinforced her belief in the importance of preserving evidence, re-examining cases with new technology, and never giving up on finding answers for families who had lost loved ones to violence. Harold Brennan's photographs, which had been instrumental in solving the case, were donated to the Burlington Historical Society as part of a collection documenting life in Vermont during the late 20th century. The photograph, showing Maggie's purse near the waterfront, was not included in the public display, out of respect for the Sullivan family, but the collection serves as a reminder of how ordinary moments can sometimes hold extraordinary significance. The Sullivan family held a memorial service for Maggie in the fall of 2025, finally able to say goodbye with the knowledge of what had happened to their daughter and sister. She was buried in Burlington's Lakeview Cemetery, overlooking the lake where her remains had been hidden for 35 years. Her gravestone bears a simple inscription: Margaret Maggie Sullivan, 1971-1989. Beloved daughter, sister, and student. Her courage lives on. Detective Rodriguez attended the memorial service, understanding that solving the case had been just the beginning of the healing process for the Sullivan family. The investigation had answered the question of who had killed Maggie and why, but it could not restore the 35 years of life she had lost or the decades of uncertainty her family had endured. As she stood at Maggie's graveside, Detective Rodriguez reflected on the nature of justice and closure. Professor Michael Brennan would spend his remaining years in prison, paying for his crime against a young woman who had trusted him and looked up to him. The Sullivan family would finally be able to move forward with their lives, knowing the truth about what had happened to Maggie. But perhaps most importantly, Maggie's story would serve as a reminder of the importance of speaking out against abuse of power, even when doing so requires tremendous courage. She had been killed for trying to tell the truth, but ultimately the truth had emerged anyway, bringing justice and accountability 35 years later. The case of Margaret Sullivan's disappearance and murder had finally come to an end, but her legacy would continue through the scholarship established in her name, the policy changes implemented to protect other students, and the memory of a young woman who had possessed the courage to stand up for what was right, even in the face of intimidation and ultimately violence.